Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local. Okay, so let's move on to the next item, which is mine. Coming off a recent vacation in Kauai, I wrote about this in the newsletter this week. I use Google very heavily, Google Maps. I used Apple. Interestingly, I used Apple in I used Apple in the car. That'll be my new startup, Apple. I used Apple in the car, and I used Google Maps in the hotel to check, restaurants and things to do and attractions and so on, and check business hours and all of that stuff. And Apple, of course, leans very heavily on Yelp. What I discovered is that, just quite sort of by accident and anecdotally, rather than sort of by intentional investigation, Google's reviews for restaurants, less so for like public places, parks and trails and things, but Google's reviews for restaurants and other kinds of things to do were consistently higher by 2 to 5 points, not like decimal points. So, 4.2, 4.5. Versus TripAdvisor and Yelp, which I looked at quite a bit. Yelp and TripAdvisor were lower. They didn't always agree, but they were consistently lower than Google's reviews. And while if it's all directionally the same and relatively the same, this restaurant outranks this restaurant, then you could argue, well, there's no harm, no foul. But I think, for me, it created expectations that were in some cases unfulfilled. And it made me think, well, why is this? And, as I said in the post, could be that Google's just more representative because they have more reviews than anybody else. Or it could be that fraud is playing a role. Or it could be that aggressive review solicitation is improving star ratings overall, as one of the Yelp research studies suggested. Or it could be, as Mike argued, that Yelp artificially depresses.
It's not that I argue they artificially depress. I argue that every one of these systems has an algorithm that has a bias, and the algorithm shapes the curve that particular company is looking for. And Yelp is looking to spread these out further within a framework, and Google doesn't care so much. They care about review volume because they're looking for data, not for necessarily consumer
fairness
benefit.
Or
and so
accuracy.
The curve that you see with each of these, the bell curve, takes place at different points on this 1 to 5 scale. And this is an intentional outcome of their algorithms. I'm not arguing that Yelp is artificially doing this. They're doing it with great intention. And one of those things, as an example, is that they filter many more positive reviews from newbies than they do negative reviews. Well, this is
they're much more skeptical of positive reviews.
Right. And there's some legitimate anti-spam there, but it's also a way to get a greater spread with lower numbers because you're focusing on Yelpers leaving reviews rather than newbies leaving reviews.
I would argue it's a less representative view of the actual experience at a business than Google or TripAdvisor is providing. Now, Google is has opened themselves up much more to spam and abuse, as you pointed out, Greg, but I think there is a happy medium, and maybe the happy medium in this case is TripAdvisor, which actively helps businesses solicit reviews from a wider swath of customers. And, I don't know what the spam ratings are, or spam history is of TripAdvisor. Mike probably knows better than either of us, but the sort of, okay, well, if you're getting slightly lower star ratings, but still getting the sort of broad swath of people you're asking for reviews, TripAdvisor, in my mind, would be the most accurate source for the kind of information you're looking for.
Potentially. I mean, TripAdvisor itself, I think, claims very low review for fraud. And they, of course, say we remove all these spammy reviews before they ever hit the consumer experience. But it was just an interesting thing for me to observe, whatever the mix of explanations, that Google was higher consistently than its competitors in mostly in the restaurant category, but in other instances too.
Just an example of an algorithmic decision, though, is that averages isn't always a mean, right? I mean, there's multiple ways statistically to calculate an average, and I can't remember the Indian company that bought the food review site, but they calculated it.
Zomato. You're talking about Zomato. Zomato.
Yeah, they calculated it. They used a different average. They didn't use mean as their average, and so their numbers were totally weird, right? So there's a lot of ways for a company to do this, and I think from a consumer point of view, consumers don't understand that there's both algorithmic as well as filtering biases. And as a consumer, you need to adjust your understanding of that reality and come up with some mechanism to make these decisions. You obviously ate while you were there. I don't know if you ate happily or not.
Well, I mean, yeah. the food we had was pretty good, and all these places. I did a lot of research, and the places we went were pretty good, but the ratings create an expectation which is disappointed, because when you're looking at a 4.7 or 4.5 or 4.4 star restaurant, you're thinking, this place is going to be pretty good. And a lot of these places were okay, but not great. And not, I mean, it's all sort of relative to the competition in a certain way.
And relative to the consumers that visit the place you visited, which didn't sound like that sophisticated a crowd.
Well, but interestingly, Hawaii is very expensive, and the food is much more expensive than a lot of the places that the tourists who come there experience on a regular basis. You're paying $6 for a cup of coffee. You're paying $27 for a pretty traditional hamburger. In many cases.
But I think Mike's comment is really spot on, though, which is like in certain there are certain categories where I don't have any sort of particular expertise or sort of knowledge of what makes a place good or not, right? And where I'm kind of at the mercy of reviews. But in categories like restaurants and golf courses, for example, microbreweries, like I'm never going to use Google for like the star ratings. Like the masses just are not going to have a reflective enough, an expert enough opinion for me to trust. And so I think that it's kind of up to you as the searcher to sort of find your sources in certain verticals that do make sense.
That goes to, then you have to look up expert lists, right? The eaters,
which Apple has started to bring into their maps results, which I think is a really smart move on their part. Yeah. So,
thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.